I usually start by introducing our organization. So I think I'll kick off from here. The RSA, the acronym is called the Royal Society of Arts, Manufacturers and Commerce. And we're an organization that was established since the 18th century, the mid 18th century, in London through the coffee house culture. And it's a very much a bottoms up creation where a group of people, very much like yourselves, came together in a coffee shop and wanted to make change because they saw so many challenges in the society at the time. One such challenge is indicated on the PowerPoint, where a lot of kids were dying because they were used to clean the chimneys in London, which, you know, it's a very specific London problem of the mid 18th century. So they basically raised money, put together, £10 here, £10 there to come up with this prize where people could submit, have like submissions, submit designs and ideas to kind of combat this problem. And that's really the birth of the RSA. And how I like to think of the RSA is that we have a very long heritage of social change and innovation, where ordinary people come together, change makers very much like yourself, and try to look at the society that they're in and address the changes that need to happen. And they do so in many different ways, whether it's, engaging in research in the 20th century, obviously engaging in research or bringing groups together to advocate for conservation efforts that happened in the mid 1970s. Or even right now, of course, with the digital explosion, we use our virtual platform to engage across different borders and regions to talk about the challenges of our time. So how I like to think about when I talk to change makers like yourselves is that, we have been running the race of social change since the mid 19th century. And then, change makers of today just take up the other leg in the race. It's a long relay. So yes, we've been anchored and have this rich tradition in social change dating back then, but now there's so many different challenges facing us: inequality, climate change, the rise of and advances in technology and the change and the major shifts that is creating throughout our society. And, the RSA over the time obviously has evolved to become this organization that started with about 20 fellows. And now we're one of the few organizations that have 30,000 fellows located all over the world. And, we have an expansive public events platform where we bring together change makers, leading change makers and thought leaders to talk about the challenges of our time. We undertake research, and one of our amazing projects is the Student Design Awards, where very much like we did back in the mid 18th century, where we had people submit designs to address the challenges. We do pretty much the same for the Student Design Awards. And then we are located in, we have global affiliates both in North America and in Oceania, where many of you are located. And then we have clusters of fellows all over the world. And, my role as the senior global manager is to engage with those fellows, as well as engage with partners so that we can, align our common values to address today's growing issues. One thing I love about this session is when we meet or meet up and convene change makers is that, there's so many things that so many people are doing. And one of the things that we'll be talking about in this session as well is how important collaboration and learning from each other and sharing best practice is. And I think the RSA is one of the few organizations that is able to do that very well. We have our own sort of approach through the living change approach, but we also encourage people to, use a multidisciplinary approach to address these challenges. And that is something that's quite unique about us. And we're very open to learning and growing from each other. I will now pass on to my colleague Ian, who will be taking us through what we're going to be doing for the rest of today's session. Ian?
Thanks, Adana. So in UK time, we have through until 10 o'clock. So it gives us about an hour and 20 minutes. Apologies for those of you in Australia, I know you've got different time zones, so I won't even begin to try and translate, but it's exciting to see, just looking at the chat, we've got people not only from Australia and New Zealand, but Germany, India, Italy, Japan, the UK. It's one of the things that has always amazes me with the RSA is we have this ability to, as Adana says, to bring people together from all sorts of different perspectives and parts of the world, and recognize where there's a lot of commonality and where there are also differences, and that's kind of cool. And that's where I think the value is in the sorts of conversations that we try and curate, and that's very much what we're going to try and do with you all today. We're going to offer, in terms of what we're going to do in the time we have together, we're each going to take it in turns to offer a sort of an invitational provocation, if there can be such a thing. We're going to share a few thoughts with you about some of the thinking that Ella and Adana and I are doing around change and how change happens and what we're learning. And then we're going to put you into small breakout groups, just randomly assigned into threes or fours, and just to enable you to meet new people and have a conversation about what's coming up for you. It may or may not be directly related to the provocations we offer, but that's absolutely fine. The things that come up are the things that should come up in the conversations that you're having. And we're going to do that hopefully 3 times if we have time. We're going to share our thoughts. I'll kick off with some thoughts around how change happens. Adana will share some thoughts around the different roles that we need in order for our change efforts to stand more likelihood of success. And then Ella's going to share some thinking around how we can look to the longer term whilst we're dealing with such immediate pressures, which is very relevant given where we are with the situation in the world at the moment. So I'll kick off then, and I'll just, as I say, I'll just share a few thoughts around what we think about when we think about change, and continue to post questions or reflections in the chat. We might not have a chance to get to all of them, but we can share those that come up in a sort of summary at the end of the session, and we'll share the slides with you as well. I always like to kick off slightly irreverently with a sort of a pop culture reference, and we talk so much about change, and yet we don't often interrogate what we mean by it. So here's a quote from Walter White in Breaking Bad, where he's talking about chemistry, but the quote is, I prefer to see it as the study of change. And he goes on to say, well, that's all of life, right? Solution and dissolution over and over and over. Growth and then decay and then transformation. And I find that really insightful, because working in local public services as I did for quite a long time, change was always like the latest plan or the latest idea that had to be implemented. And so you kind of had a light switch situation where, it was either on or off. It was either pre-change or post-change. And nowhere along the way did we think about what you might lose in order to accommodate the new. And that's something that we thought about quite a lot. It's, the reason that so many pilots or, those sort of small scale experiments tend to fail is because they'll get layered onto a history and a legacy of lots of other experiments and pilots in organizations. And what we don't do is stop doing the things that are now obsolete in order to enable the new things to land and the new things to flourish. And that's something that I've certainly thought quite deeply about in the last sort of 3 or 4 years. Is it's as important to think about what we stop in order to enable the new things to emerge. And sometimes we don't know what those new things are either. Sometimes we just know that there are things that are past their time. And if we cut those out of our practice, of our organizations or our daily lives or our community, then perhaps that offers space for new to emerge, and often the unpredictable and sometimes the innovative. And then just thinking about what this might mean on a more personal level, this idea about change being the bedrock of narrative. And John York's written this great book about stories and why we tell them. And the thing that I take from that is change is so ever present, we often take it for granted, but from a narrative point of view, if nothing changes, then there is no story. Then everything's ossifying. You know, everything is basically paused and frozen in time. So everything is constantly changing. And this idea, therefore, that it's the bedrock of life. And I used to get quite frustrated in my public sector days where change was always seen as an event. And so I've definitely taken this notion that it's much more of a continuation, a continuous, you know, life is all about change, and it's sort of, and potentially a sort of a Western European phenomenon, or a Western phenomenon more broadly, that we think we can control such change processes when often they're emergent and they change and control us. And this, again, this idea of in observing new stimuli in the world, we're altered in the process. And the picture here is of the Mississippi. And Mark Twain writes about how the intrinsic beauty of the river and the landscape was lost to him once he had learned the technical skills needed to navigate the river safely. So this thing about you can take on board learning and you can change as yourself, and it gives you a completely different outlook, but along the way, you lose something in order to gain something. And then just to think about some of the conditions that are present in a change effort. This is, again, slightly provocative, the idea that you can even have a formula. But some of the thoughts in here are useful. The idea that change is most likely when there's a degree of dissatisfaction with the current state, that there's a notion of what a compelling future might look like, that there is a practical first step towards that future, and that all of those are greater than the resistance or the cost, the pain of change. What I call the immune response, the sort of self-preserving tendencies of organizations and systems and groups. The interesting thing here is that with the little multipliers, it suggests that if you're missing either dissatisfaction or a vision or a practical first step, then change won't happen. So again, it's just interesting to build out some of the ideas behind a sort of a change effort. And then finally, we look quite a lot at the RSA about different levels or different domains of change, that change happens at an individual level when we feel that we have some sense of agency to create that change, and some degree of motivation to make that change in our own lives or context. That change happens at a social level where we build solidarity within our society, within our communities, where we might share norms and values, but also we have institutional hierarchical rules and power that are also ways in which we see change come about. And one of the things that we've explored at the RSA is how change is most likely when there's an alignment of all three coming together. And I guess the quote on the right, I love this book by Rebecca Solnit, and the quote here really illustrates for me the idea that in response to a disaster or a crisis or a shock to the system, those sort of ties that bind us are released and freed up. And that means that new things become possible on an individual level. It might be that we're moving house and suddenly all of our previous patterns of life need to be rethought and reinvented. So that's an opportunity for change. It might be at a community level that things are shifting. But she talks about how there's this sort of emergent struggle between everybody that benefited from what came before and those that are trying to rebuild, reshape things into maybe a more, more oppressive or perhaps a more optimistic future. And so in the result of a sort of a disaster or a shock to the system, we see this tension play out. We talk and think quite a lot about how there are always multiple ideas and visions for the future, and therefore there's a lot of tensions that people find themselves navigating through these change processes. So those are just some initial thoughts and provocations around some sort of broad underpinnings of change. What we're going to do now is we're going to give you a 10-minute breakout to enable you just to reflect on anything that came up for you as I was talking through that, meet some new people and hopefully have an interesting conversation. And then when we come back into the room, we'll hear a couple of voices if anybody's happy to share with a wider group.
I'm just going to open the breakout rooms now. So just click on the box as it appears on your screen. Hope you have a good discussion.
Everybody back now, Ella? Before we move on to the next provocation from Ella, does anybody have any insights or thoughts that you'd like to share with the wider group? Victoria, you also win an award for putting your virtual hand up.
I can't believe it. I did
asked.
Mute. I guess we had a little group of 3, and we talked about what motivated us, or what we found motivating about change. And I was really struck by how different our experiences were, and how different we were in what motivated us. So for me, it was about agency and autonomy and feeling like I've got some ownership. But for Cal, it was more about getting energy from others who are quite different in their style. And then for Tim, it was about using skills and having a challenge. So it was just really fascinating to see how we're all motivated or engaged in different sort of ways.
Cool.
Very good.
Great. Love those insights. And that plays into some of the stuff that I think Adana's going to share next. Anybody else want to share? Thanks, Victoria. Andy, I can see you've got your actual hand up, so go for it.
So we're in a conversation of 2, and we talked about having time to think about change and the role of thinking and the importance, and how thinking leads to actions and leads to results. And we talked about the difference between the external stimulus that you mentioned in your thought provocation and the internal reaction to change, and the mental transition and adjustment people have to go through. So we started talking about organizational change and the role of managers and leaders in giving their people time to think, and how to help them make endings and disassociate from the old, and the mental adjustment. So we got into change versus transition. And in order for an individual to change, they have to change a thought, and therefore the question comes, where does that thought come from? And we started to talk about the self-empowerment when we have a light bulb moment and feel engaged by a new thought, to when things are imposed on us, perhaps government lockdown or an organizational transformation of processes, where we feel powerless about that. That's a concise summary of what we covered.
That sounds like you had a really fascinating 10 minutes. That whole thing about intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation, and when you're commanded to do something, it can often drive out all of your intrinsic motivation to do stuff is fascinating as well. Maybe one more voice if someone else would like to share. No worries if not. What? Go on then. I can see Tim.
You can see me waving. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. There was something we sort of brushed on from, who was talking? Was it Andy just now? Yeah. Was it Andy who just spoke about you responding to your surroundings, basically, and you're gathering knowledge from them, you're interpreting it in your head, and then you apply it and change things, because it's part of the same process. It's science, which is a gathering of knowledge, and art, which is the application of knowledge, a part of that process. And it's a bit in the middle that's the important bit, where you actually interpret that knowledge in the right way, or in a way that you want it to create a change, if you see what I mean. Yeah, so that fitted in with my thinking.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, interesting way of looking at things. We sort of use a provocation of, is it part art, part science? Is it alchemy? Who knows? It's definitely one of those things that. Yeah, and we all surf the sort of the wave of change in different ways, I guess. But just before I start screen sharing again and hand over to Adana, it occurs to me, prompted by a really helpful question someone's just pinged me, is if there are any particular sources of inspiration that you draw upon on the call. So it might be a book, it might be a person, it might be a document or a website or a YouTube video. Feel free to share any of those resources that you go to or you draw upon in your work and in your change efforts. And then we can sort of crowdsource the wisdom in the room, and then we'll share it back at the end. So that would be cool if you're happy to do that in the chat as we go. Brilliant. I'm going to bring the slides back up again and hand over to Adana for the next piece.
Thanks, Ian. That was really cool listening to what was happening in the breakout rooms. It's so amazing when you bring people together, how much we kind of think similarly and in some ways, and then how much, someone raises something that kind of challenges our thinking. So thank you so much for being so forthcoming in your conversations. I just want to start by what Victoria brought up actually when she opened up the discussion about, when you bring people together in your change efforts, you quickly become aware that people have different styles. And at the RSA, we look at that where when you bring different people together, everyone sort of fulfills a role. And then there are roles that people naturally come with. That's sometimes their superpower. And there are roles that, the change effort will need. Most likely, like if you're dealing with a crisis situation, for example, you may not need, there's certain things that you would need where, someone is an active problem solver, or even in certain situations, you need someone who holds the information, or someone who holds some institutional memory to shepherd you through the crisis. So yeah, this is what I really want us to get into in this section of the session. Try to think about what roles in your own kind of life and project and your change making process do you fulfill, and think about the project in the wider scope in terms of, okay, in order to possibly elevate or scale the project, what roles do we actually need? At the RSA, we came up with taxonomy, or different types of roles. And this part is always interesting to me, where we try to figure out, okay, where do we fit in? And this kind of charts out, in any change making process, these roles sometimes become very, very much in need. So if you have a look at the slide, we have things like the scanner or the trend spotter, someone who is able to look and see what trends are coming and how the organization or the change effort can adapt, or the project can respond. You have roles such as the fixer, someone who's behind the scenes. You have someone who's the disruptor. And I know, in recent years, the disruptor has had such a spotlight on them, where, someone who will, try to introduce new ideas that will almost break the system or reframe the narrative. And then you have those persons that convert the ideas into action. How do you take something that's like a concept and actually make it a reality? And obviously, in different change circumstances, those different roles will become more prominent. I just want to go through three that I think are really, really important. The first one is the fairy godmother. And this is actually my favorite one, because I actually, in all my kind of projects that I've been involved with, I actually kind of gravitate towards the fairy godmother. And it's really someone who kind of helps orchestrate a change process that can allow people to realize their fullest potential. They're often very savvy. They're often very clever and know how to get things done. What we like to say, run interference behind the scenes. And they're able to allow people to navigate the internal politics of maybe making something happen, or they're aware of what happens, how to connect with gatekeepers, or how to unlock resources so that people would be able to bring ideas into action. And they're also really good at connecting the dots. And that is something I think we all in our own sort of lives and projects know how important it is, because sometimes you're so much in the middle of your own process that you're too much in the weeds and you can't see, you can't lift your head up and see the bigger picture. And sometimes the fairy godmother is someone that, is able to allow you to see the bigger picture and make the whole thing realize. And realize its fullest potential. And then you have like almost the opposite in the stabilizer, the one that, really is cautious, someone who really wants to make sure that we put our efforts into things that have a proven track record. That I like to think of that person as the wait person. Let's just wait and figure things out. Let's do things more in line with the status quo. Very much push back. They're the ones in the room who said, "Well, this is the way we always do things. So why would we deviate?" And as a rebellious teenager, growing up, those aren't the people that I would normally gravitate to. And for those of us who are in change process that want to buck against the system, that's not some people we gravitate to, but they're very good to have in the room, because I think the cool thing about the stabilizer is that they allow some grit to get involved in the thinking. Those challenges allows us to refine what we're proposing, and also prepares us for the future challenges that we might hold later on. And lastly, the final role is the shaman. And I always think this role is quite an invisible role. They're the ones who pretty much behind the scenes who tend to protect and nurture the project. They tend to appeal to our better ideals, sort of, try to probe what is the intention behind the change initiative that we're undertaking. They're the keep of the flame, and they help to create a culture where there is a spirit of collaboration, and really try to interrogate the motivation behind the project. They try to protect the heart of the project. And that is something sometimes when you're so much into the weeds that sometimes get lost, and you're kind of firefighting and dealing with different challenges and, dealing with the mechanics of it. And whereas the shaman is the other people in our project group that protect the heart of it. Try to always remind us, what is at the heart of this thing that we want to do? What is our purpose? And I think that's quite powerful, because oftentimes, and I'm sure, many of the people on the call have been in situations where, purpose is the only thing that gets you over the line. Sometimes you're so exhausted and weary, and you just, you're almost at the brink of, giving up, that oftentimes it's like you go back to what was the thing that gave birth to this idea. And that oftentimes is the thing that motivates you to make it a reality. And I think, the shaman is incredibly important role. When you look at the entire taxonomy, or the different types of roles that we have, I'm sure you're trying to right now try to figure out, where do I fit in? Am I the scribe? Am I the stabilizer? Am I the scanner? And, for those of you who are actively involved in incubating an idea right now, or maybe right at the midpoint or at the tail end, I think it's really important that I don't want you to leave this session thinking that you have to fulfill all the roles. Actually, it's the complete opposite. You have to actually try to draw in collaborators that will have these different styles that Veronica mentioned at the beginning that could help make the role a reality. So I'm sure you're kind of tired of hearing me talking, and I'm really interested in learning about your different projects and your different roles. Let's take the opportunity now to go into some breakout groups and have some discussions. in terms and talk about what has come up for you in terms of the roles that you fulfill. What is your superpower and what role do you fulfill in your project? And also, what roles do you think that you need in going through your own change process? So let's go into breakout rooms. I know that was a lot to digest. Let's go into breakout rooms and start having some deep discussions about roles and who's the fixer and who's the fairy godmother, etc.
Should all be able to go into your breakout rooms now. We'll have 10 minutes or so.
Hi guys, welcome back.
Hiya.
Yeah, I'm really interested in hearing what was discussed in your groups. So anyone wants to share? The floor is yours.
Paolo, you're there? Paolo?
I see Christina's hand up, so Paolo could go after Christina. Christina?
Hi, we talked about a couple of things, but one of the ones in terms of the roles was I feel quite strongly that there's now becoming a need for a role of quite a senior change strategist. I work in organisational change in large-scale corporate, and the more complex and chaotic the environment is, the more I'm seeing the need to be helping senior teams get the position and the thinking of a change strategist. So it's someone who is looking outside and doing all the boundary riding and looking at the trends and things in terms of threats and opportunities.
Yeah.
But it's not just that strategy piece, it's really knowing transformation and knowing at the back of their organisation, what could this impact be on the culture and how ready the organisation to deal with extreme potential change trends that are coming along. So it's a really serious change transformation role at the senior team level. So that's my thinking, which someone in my team said, is it the fairy godmother? And I think it's a combination of probably at least 3 or 4 roles in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Adana, may I come in?
Yeah, of course, Ashok, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think Shelley, Paolo, Brendan, and me were in room number 1, and we had some very interesting discussion. And 2 things came out very clearly, and I would like any one of my colleagues to add here, that all of us, play a lot of role that you described in your presentation, depending upon the context and the nature of the project, our own expertise with the nuances of the project. And sometimes we end up playing a couple of roles there. And the second thing which came out by way of one demonstration that, I think thinking and curiosity, which is inbuilt in the human thought process, that also triggers change. And as a result of that change, we start assuming what kind of role we are going to play. So these are the 2 things which came out very clearly. And maybe Paolo or Shelley, Brendan, anybody can add to what I said.
Thanks, Ashok. Anyone else? You have time for one more comment. Oh, Ava. Sorry, I didn't see your hand up.
Hi. No, I just put it up like 1 second ago. You didn't miss it. So I was in a group with Sally, Carl, and Ali, and we spoke a lot about this too, that everyone has several different roles to play. And so I'm a founder of a nonprofit, which means I have to play everything at certain times and then find people who can play other roles together with me and the group. And we compared it to a recipe where you have spices and you basically use, some spices are predominant, but then you always have a little bit of another spice too. And, kind of it tastes different on different days. But you kind of need all of it in the mix. And you would recognize if you miss any of them somehow. So there was one comparison. And then something else was that we discussed, if you have to know who you are in there, or if it's helpful even to know the different roles. And it was different because some of us said, no, I just do things, and I'll just see what happens basically, or, just behave in a very natural way. And for me personally, it's always really helpful to see a structure and then almost fill the gaps. So then to understand, okay, in this particular situation or meeting, I should, put more emphasis on that role, and then I shift to another role. And I think it's extremely helpful to see almost a guide on how to navigate these roles.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Eva. I love that metaphor of the spices. I'm actually going to probably steal that. Because you always have certain things. You always have salt. You always have, but then you might add some chili on top of that. So thank you so much for that, Eva. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ella, who will take us through the final bit of today's session.
Great. So I'm going to skip very, very lightly over this big topic of long-term thinking so that we can get into some discussion and really hear from you. I think we'll stay in a group to have a discussion around this provocation question. How do we think long-term when faced with immediate pressures? And I'll start by saying, that the world is facing some enormous long-term challenges, and I mean, one thing that comes to mind is climate change, amongst so many other things. And we've been doing quite a lot of thinking around the role of helping us to navigate the present moment, and how stretching forward and casting ahead can help us to navigate different outcomes, and really think about what might be possible, and what might a better future look like for more people, so that we can really change our actions today in order for us to not constrain the options that are presenting out in front of us. So on the next slide, I should also say that we're all from different parts of the globe, and there are some people and cultures and traditions who think very deeply about the long term and about futures, and do this very well in their contexts. But on a global scale, there's a big push and pull between where we place our energy. Is it on the immediate pressures, of which we just need to open the newspaper today, or really keep thinking about our longer term kind of directions? And really, one of the messages that we're exploring is actually how we kind of need both. And some of the big drivers of change is the undercurrent that change is, as Ian said before, happening all of the time, and sort of this undercurrent of around the environment, around kind of aging populations, around how power, voice and democracy are kind of showing up in the world, real kind of rapid developments that are having all sorts of repercussions in terms of technology and AI, the future of work and the economy. But one thing that we're sort of interested in is kind of how the past and our experiences our experiences kind of influence how we feel about moving towards something new, the opportunities that present before us, and there is a sense sometimes that there's a desire to return back to the way things where we are, the things that we're familiar with, things that we're comfortable with, and underlying that is sort of like an underlying core belief, a set of narratives that have sort of guided the way that we think and act and be, these sort of deep myths and legends and ways like the kind of like past experiences that we draw from, can have a real impact on the way we think about our opportunities, our hopes, our expectations, our dreams, our fears. And so another thing that we've just been really interested in is how can we really challenge how we're showing up today, and with all of that experience that's come before us, so that we can think quite radically differently about what might be possible, and to think differently about the futures and create new stories that we can work with. And then I just mentioned this at the beginning, and this is really the question that the question that we want to unpack with you is there are a key kind of often it comes as a criticism or a challenge, is that well, how can we create time to think about the long term, to think about the future, when in our individual lives and in our societies there are some very real challenges that we need to address right now and here and now. And these 6 drivers on the left-hand side. These were put together by Roman Krasnarek, who wrote a book called The Good Ancestor, which is another of things to read. And he talks about how we've got to a point where we are driven to short-term thinking in much of our society. So just to pick out a few, he talks about sort of the tyranny of the clock and sort of this drive towards productivity and quick wins and quick tasks, digital distraction where our attention is being pulled in all sorts of different directions, political presenteeism where we're governed by sort of election cycles and the incentives that are driven by them. So those are just a couple of things that really pull us into this short-term thinking. And then on the right-hand side of this slide, he kind of goes quite expansive into 6 ways to think long-term about understanding ourselves in the context of sort of the cosmos and the wider universe and expansion of time that exists and lies out both behind and in front of us. Also, this legacy mindset. How do we want to be remembered, and what legacy do we want to leave? Things like intergenerational justice. What's fair for the next generation? How are we leaving the world and how can we leave the world in a better place for generations to come? So I won't go into all of these because you can see them, and I would recommend his book. But these are just a couple of things to think about when balancing kind of the long term with the short term. I think one thing to say is that the future is the past, the present, the future can almost be seen to exist at the same time. We are working, as we work through our present, we are working into the future. And so it is part of being human to think about our futures. And we wrote this report back in 2020 called A Stitch in Time, realising the value of futures and foresight and that centres around long-term thinking and how we can embed and reorientate our society to think a little bit more about the longer term. And much of this is to do with how we develop a futures culture within our societies, how we develop futures competencies within our organisations, and really think about the incentive structures and the kind of the different processes that organisations might be able to embed that supports that way of thinking. And for policy makers as well, it's really important to develop a futures mindset. The policies that are embedded today have real life impacts on people and on our futures. So Adana's just posted a link to that report in there. But just on, I think this is the last slide, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. element that I find really fascinating to talk about is that often questions around the future and decisions that are made around the future can be made by a privileged few people, and as I said before, can have rippling impacts on others and different members of society. So one question we ask is, who gets to imagine the future, and where and when and how? And how can people also have that agency that we've discussed a little bit in chats before, to be able to shape their own futures in service to a wider vision for society? So I'll stop there, and then it would be great to open out to have a little bit of a discussion to see what came up for you around this idea of longer term thinking. And we'll stay in the group. But if you prefer to sort of write notes in the comments, and if you're someone who likes to interact in that kind of way, then just message in the chat, and we can pick up some of these ideas. I'd be really interested to hear from you around what you think the role of long-term thinking is when we're faced with the immediacy of the here and now and the pressures that we have today.
Mm-hmm. Victoria, I think, go.
Hi, I'm off mute this time as well. Hooray. I thought I'd just share a brief reflection, which is I've been thinking a lot about emergence, and I think that my takeaway from today is emergence over events. And I do a lot of work with the NHS, sort of introducing human-centered design type approaches, and I'm doing some work with an NHS trust around values at the moment. And there are so many external pressures, and the NHS isn't one organisation, it's multiple organisations, but I think there's a very strong culture of reacting to what's directly in front because of the external environment and some of the sort of cultures. So this idea about thinking of change as an emergent quality enacted and reenacted by people through conversations and discussion, I'm really taken with, and I've really enjoyed that insight right at the beginning about we think about change as events, which happens all the time in the NHS, just like this strata of event after event that never quite sort of does what it intends to do, and then another event appears and emerges. So I suppose just want to reflect that that I think in the sector that I tend to work with, this idea of long-term change is just such a challenging thing to do. But I think if I can help people to think about change in that slightly different way, maybe there's just a little glimmer of hope there. I don't know. Thank you.
That's really great. I can see that you put in the chat from the long-term thinking starts with feeling a sense of presence and stillness within myself, stepping back from reactivity. Said that as well.
Someone earlier said about the importance of having time and space to think, and that's, I think, what often gets crowded out and forces us into those short-term perspectives. So I get that, like that, how to create that stillness and step back, create that space, I think is important.
I also, in addition to just having the time and space to think, I think it's interesting to almost open up your mind to want to take on inspiration for change. So, maybe people on this call are like typically more open towards this than maybe on other calls we could be in. But I think that's really interesting to me. How do you, for oneself, how do you make that happen and make sure you are accepting new points of view at all times and in very different directions, but also how do you support others to be able to do this and to be open for it?
I think building on what Victoria was saying earlier, I also do quite a bit of work in the NHS. And one of the things we've got to remember is that if you're under immediate pressure, there are certain parts of your body that shut down to cope with that. One of them is your reproductive system. and one of them is your long-term planning abilities. And therefore, what I see in a lot of organizations is people that are forced into doing strategic planning when they're totally under stress, and therefore they're not equipped for it. So, if you're running away from a bear, you are not likely to A, have sex, and B, do long-term planning, right? But we put our leaders in that position to say, right, give us a 3-year strategy and a plan when they're metaphorically running away from a bear. So I'll just leave that one with you.
Excellent.
Thanks for that, Andy.
I need a slide with a bear on it next time. Oh, that's funny. I know we're nearly out of time, but perhaps that feels like an interesting point towards a close. But does anybody else want to try and follow that?
I was just putting it in the chat. I think, how do we think long term when faced with immediate pressure? Is to know that you're part of a community. So to find allies in the process of addressing such change and share the pressure. So, for instance, belonging to the RSA is a way, you can ask. You don't feel alone. You can someone else has already had this experience probably, and can support you and coach you, and so the idea of not feeling that you are the only one addressing that change. Yes, better together, as Sandy wrote. Yes. Also, what you were bringing as an example of bears and other things.
Well,
lovely slides, really good, really inspiring. I'm a slow learner, so I need to reflect on the session, and I hope there will be more. So it was great to it's one of the first time I've been an RSA member, a fellow for 5-6 years, but it's one of the first time I joined a meeting, and I'm really happy.
Cool.
You have all our email addresses? Practical question? Yeah? Okay, good.
Yeah.
And maybe just one more to add on the bear story. I can only describe the problem and have no solution there, but 2 examples that show the problem. One is saving for the pension is one example, and the other is our environmental issues we have. Whenever people tend to avoid smaller pains today, and they're not thinking about the much more severe pains in the future, because there's this time and distance bias. And I can describe that. I have no clue how to address that. It seems to be so inbuilt.
Did you say saving for the tension?
No, it's saving for the pension. So
pension.
So
no.
Not to go to the cinema today. Not to go to the cinema today in order to have something to eat in 30 years.
My misunderstanding triggered a reflection. Change is inevitable, and so I understood saving for the tension. For saving energy, being prepared, because sometime there will be an emergency that you have to cope with. So be ready for that. Preparedness.
Nice misunderstanding. Like it.
We like those moments. Thanks, everyone. I'm aware we're a minute over time, so time to draw things to a close. I don't know, Adana, if you wanted just to say a quick word to send everybody on their way.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. I know, we're living in the most overused word for the last 2 years, unprecedented times, though, as we all know, if you're students of history, it is precedented. But, this morning before we joined the call, a lot of us, I was mentioning to my colleagues that I have brain fog. It seems like, I'm all over the place, but, it's always really grounding and heartwarming and incredibly nourishing to speak to fellows all over the world who are doing amazing work. And, as Paolo just mentioned, you feel you have a community. So as much as possible, we would love for you to reach out to us. I know Ian's going to flash our contact details. We will definitely share the slides. I know there are some Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Fellows on the call who've recently joined the RSA, and you're based in Oceania. And please feel free to reach out to our colleague, Philippa, or even reach out to myself, Ian, or Ella. It's so heartwarming and incredibly nourishing to meet you all. And this has been such an inspirational start to the day for us. So thank you so much for sharing and bringing your whole selves to today's session.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.